Good afternoon and welcome. Look at the graphics. They're different. Is it being extra? Maybe. Do I care? No. No, I don't. So, welcome to Writer's Workshop. This is what you're going to see when a new Writer's Workshop lesson begins, similar to any other subject. Over here, this time, are the materials you'll need today. And today, we're just going to keep it simple and give ourselves a little bit of an intro. Okay, there will be an exit ticket on Google Classroom as soon as this lesson is done. But you don't need to write anything while I'm giving the intro. We're going to write afterwards. Here's today's I can. I can explain the difference between fantasy and realistic fiction. Because the opening of our reading and writing work this year is going to be around fantasy fiction. Now, you may have read, I'm sure many of you have read fantasy fiction before, but one thing we want to do as writers and as readers as well is really think about those clear differences between fantasy fiction and what we call realistic fiction. Okay, so we're just going to briefly go through those here on our little chart. Now, there are many similarities between fantasy fiction and realistic fiction. Okay, both of them, and let me grab my black pen here, both of them, at their heart, they're about a good story and the journey of a main character or perhaps a group of characters. Okay, so at their core, realistic fiction and fantasy fiction are similar in that way, where if you have a story that isn't really focusing on one central idea or one sort of thing that's driving the action, it's not going to be the most engaging story no matter what universe you choose to set your story in. The big difference is where realistic fiction and fantasy fiction differ is in that setting. So with realistic fiction, it's always going to take place in our world, in this realistic realm. Okay. So in realistic fiction, nothing is going to happen, or nothing, there are no rules in the story about the setting that wouldn't happen in real life. Okay, that's where those fantasy elements come in. Okay, if you have an element of your story, no matter how small, that has something about it that wouldn't happen in real life or couldn't happen in real life due to physics or lack of magic or what have you, that would be considered in the realm of fantasy, in the genre of fantasy. So really thinking about a realistic fiction story feels like a story that you'd read or that you could potentially see or live out. Whereas fantasy, we have to do a little bit of what's calling suspending disbelief, and we'll talk about that in a second. Let me write down our fantasy elements here. So, there we go. So I wrote there can include any setting provided there are rules. One of the biggest things about fantasy fiction and writing anything that isn't realistic is there still have to be rules for that world. If it was a world or a universe where anybody could do anything at any time and anything could change into anything at any time, there isn't a lot of conflict. And you could always solve a problem by just creating something out of nowhere. And that can be really tricky because how are plots supposed to resolve? How are conflicts supposed to resolve if there aren't sort of rules to govern how that conflict is going to go? So in great fantasy, fantasy writers not only have a good plot and some good characters, a good main character and some strong secondary characters to drive the action along, but also they've thought about the world that they've built, and they really keep very strictly to that world. If you take, for example, Harry Potter, right? If you take Harry Potter and you think about that world that J.K. Rowling has constructed, where there are Muggles and there are magical folk, and there are certain ways that magical folk have to live because otherwise Muggles would lose it, and it's a very logical choice of thinking about, well, what would happen if non-magical people knew that there were magical people, right? There's so many different avenues you can go down. And so one of the rules that J.K. Rowling wrote for the magical community was that they were going to be secret, because it kind of has to be that way. And it makes for some conflict, right? If you're having a wand duel in the middle of, the London Underground, in the middle of the subway, people are going to notice, and that's an extra layer of conflict, okay? And I put science fiction down here at the bottom because there is a difference between fantasy and science fiction, but in terms of building a world, they are similar in that they're both kind of fantastic in that they're not realistic worlds. The difference I see between fantasy and science fiction, usually we call fantasy like fairies and wizards and dragons, and science fiction like time travel and robots and space and that kind of a thing. But there's a real difference for me between fantasy and science fiction in the amount of explaining that gets done, and the amount of this idea of what we call suspending disbelief. When I say that readers have to suspend disbelief, what I mean is they have to agree. Readers have to come to an agreement with the author in fantasy fiction and in science fiction that even if something happens in the story that can't happen in real life, we have the understanding, we have the agreement that it can happen in that world because the author has built that world around certain rules. Okay, again, if there are no rules, it's hard to get a picture of what universe or what world or what reality we're reading in, and so it takes us out of the story. It's harder to suspend that disbelief if there's too many fantastic things happening. Okay, there aren't, in the Harry Potter universe, there isn't magic and also dragons and also robots and also spacecraft and also the multiple stories, and there aren't sword fights in castles because this is taking place in the 1990s, that kind of a thing. Okay, it's still grounded in one particular time and one particular world. Science fiction just does more explaining. My example of this is with Star Wars. And the idea, and really kind of what I think, is that the original Star Wars movies, Star Wars, Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi, they're not actually science fiction, even though they take place in space. They're fantasy stories. Because in those movies, this is not true in the later movies, but they don't bother to explain why some people can use the Force and other people can't. They don't bother to explain how spaceships can travel through hyperspace. They don't explain how a lightsaber works. Since then, they've gone back and explained those things in either science fiction books or in subsequent movies. But in the original 3 movies, they don't explain any of that. They want you to suspend disbelief and just go, in this world, lightsabers are a thing and they exist, and only people who can use the Force can use them. And we go, yeah, okay. Yeah, I'll buy that. Sure. What's next? Right? And we're willing to suspend that disbelief because it's a good story, and at its heart, it's about a journey of a hero and all the subsequent and side characters, the secondary characters that come along with that hero. Right? We're willing to suspend our disbelief and just believe the creators that lightsabers exist where people can use the Force and move things with their mind and control people with their minds. We're willing to just believe that because the story is really good. Okay? If the story's not good, we're like, I don't know. I'm a little bit out of it. Okay? So science fiction, I'm going to write down that it's really like fantasy plus explaining. Going back to the Harry Potter example, there is a bit of science fiction in Harry Potter in terms of the way J.K. Rowling writes. For instance, the wands and at Ollivander's wand shop. They talk a lot about how different woods to make wands are stronger in different magical areas, or different cores at the heart of wands they can make you stronger in some areas and weaker in other areas, right? That's a little bit of that explaining thing, okay? Harry Potter is not true science fiction because they don't go into everything, right? There is no explaining of why some people are magic and why some people aren't, or why Muggle parents can have a magical child or magical parents can have a Muggle child. They don't go into explaining that because it's not important to the story. It doesn't serve the story. When it's necessary to explain something, great fantasy authors do explain it. And when it's not necessary to explain it, why spend that extra time on something that isn't adding more to your story? Okay? Now, there are many genres, many different sort of sections of fantasy. We've already talked about a couple of them, right? We have kind of that like more futuristic fantasy. This can include something like Star Wars, even though it happened a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. We think of like spaceships and space travel and lasers and that kind of a thing as futuristic because they haven't existed in our world yet, but could in the future, theoretically. So there's that genre of fantasy fiction. There's also what we call the medieval fantasy fiction, kind of like Lord of the Rings. There's swords and armor and castles, but there's also dragons, and there's often magical elements like Gandalf in Lord of the Rings. And there's, spells and potions and that kind of a thing. But existing in this like damsel in distress, knights on horseback and sword battles and that kind of a thing. So there's that genre too. Another futuristic genre is what we call dystopian. Dystopian means there's not really a society, right? Society's broken down. These are your zombie stories. These are your Hunger Games, your Divergent, right? Where it's a future, but it's kind of a bleak future, and our characters have to work within that world. And one thing that we're going to go through in the next couple of weeks is thinking about what fantasy world is going to serve my story and tell my story the best. And so we're going to have to do a couple of different things. We're going to have to think about what kinds of worlds do I want to write in, and also what kind of story do I want to tell? Because just like realistic fiction, at its heart, it's about a character going on a journey. It's about a character learning something, or by proxy having the reader learn something or learn a lesson. Okay? That can happen in fantasy fiction as well, and that needs to happen in fantasy fiction to make it an engaging story. There's just that extra element of world building to enhance the story. Okay? There is an exit ticket. on Google Classroom. It's going into sort of activating our prior knowledge about this. What kinds of fantasy have we already read? What kinds of fantasy do you think we might want to try writing in a short story format? We're not writing novels in 6 to 7 weeks, as much as I would like to. We're not writing novels yet. Okay, well, you'll get to your novel writing. And exactly, I think that's all. I think I said it all. Exit tickets on Google Classroom. Writing small group B, you're going to meet me in the Zoom room. We're going to talk a little more about what those writing small groups are going to entail and how we're going to work together to read our own writing and read each other's writing. All right, everybody, thank you for tuning in. Go do that exit ticket. I think it's iReady when you're done with that. And 1:30 Makerspace.